This is the leading news from the Albuquerque Journal. I'm Gino Gutierrez. It's Wednesday, August 5th. Here's what we're covering on today's episode. New Mexico's push to the front of the line, or at least close to it, in the 2028 presidential primary calendar could place the state in the national political spotlight, while also causing some logistical headaches. With more on this development, I'm now joined by the Journal's Capitol Bureau Chief, Dan Boyd. Dan, thank you for joining me.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
So Dan, this is not the first time we've heard about New Mexico pining to be a part of the primary presidential process, and now the Democratic National Convention is on the cusp of final approval that would put New Mexico in that position. But as you mentioned in your story, and I said at the start of this, it could create some logistical headaches in the state. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this is something that's been talked about for a while. It seemed like kind of a long shot earlier this year. The state Democratic Party applied to be one of these early primary states, with the thinking that these states get a lot more national attention. Candidates visit them more often, more campaign ads. They're kind of really more on the national spotlight when it comes to picking the presidential nominees. Fast forward just last week, subcommittee of the Democratic National Committee, voted and did include New Mexico as among 6 states on this early state window. And now that that's happened, it's still not a done deal yet, but states kind of looking ahead to, how will they make this change take place? And what will it really mean, if the state does move up its primary to middle of February instead of kind of first Tuesday in June has been the case in recent years.
And Dan, before we get into the logistics of this, I want to talk a little bit about the background of why New Mexico officials have been really pushing for this. It's something that you've mentioned in your reporting before. State officials here in New Mexico really feel like New Mexico's electorate is a good reflection of the state of the country now, a pretty diverse group of individuals. You have a lot of different socioeconomic circumstances here, and they feel like that could lend itself to helping with the presidential election process.
Yeah, that's been a big part of their push, that New Mexico is a border state, obviously, has a high percentage of Hispanic and Native American residents. Spoke with House Speaker Javier Martinez. He really thought that having New Mexico in this early window would bring more attention to border-related issues, certainly immigration, but also commerce, water use, things like that, and would make candidates, seeking the presidential nomination kind of stake out positions on these issues and maybe kind of elevate the importance of, border-related policies.
So Dan, as we established earlier in the interview, if this were to be approved by the DNC, then New Mexico would find itself in a double election season where in 2028 you would have the presidential primary in February and the primary elections for local and statewide offices would remain in June, but that would all be dependent, according to your reporting, on the New Mexico legislature.
Yeah, that's right. There is still some uncertainty about exactly what this is going to look like, assuming this proposed calendar does get approved. There is the option of moving up all primary races into February instead of June, but that could be tricky. And even House Speaker Martinez said, it wouldn't be ideal to have legislative primaries, for example, in February while the legislature is still in session. Of course, there's other statewide races that'll be on the ballot, congressional races, having those primaries in June. So he said he favors kind of, as you mentioned, 2 separate primaries, the presidential primary in February and then keeping the other, primary races in June where they currently are. Interestingly, Republican gubernatorial nominee Greg Hull said he might have some misgivings with that approach, specifically due to the cost of holding 2 different primary elections. We don't know at this point exactly what that cost will be, but the Secretary of State's office did tell me that they're analyzing that issue and what the costs associated with these different approaches would be. They did kind of clarify that there will have to be legislation passed during next year's 60-day session, to make that happen, since right now in statute, our primary is in June. So different ways they could go with this, but, there are some kind of logistical hurdles that, will have to be crossed at some point to make this happen.
And Dan, when you think of the idea of having a second primary election day, what comes to mind, I'm sure for you, for me, and for our listeners as well, is when you're voting, those are volunteers that have to man those polling locations. The state will now have to open up those polling locations for a second time in an election year. So a lot of logistics they're going to have to figure out around that. But I'm curious, you mentioned Republican gubernatorial candidate Greg Hull in that last answer. Have we heard from the Democratic nominee Deb Haaland about what she thinks about this?
Yeah, I've reached out to her campaign as well, and they said she fully supports, New Mexico moving up its presidential primary, and that she would sign legislation if she's elected governor to kind of make that happen. That said, I think you raised some good points about already the state has struggled to find poll workers, to staff these elections, and now adding another primary election, having to find the workers, the costs associated with that. So I do think, I expect there to be some debate about that during the 60-day session. I think we should see in the coming weeks a little more clarity on exactly what approach, but it's worth pointing out that Democrats have really been the ones driving this in New Mexico, kind of seeking out this early state status. And as of right now, at least, they have a majority in the legislature, currently a Democrat in the governor's office. And so I think they could kind of make this happen as things currently stand. We'll see how the election, obviously, in November shakes out.
And Dan, one last question before I let you go. We talked a lot about how the legislature is really going to be one of the key decision makers in this process. But one thing that really caught my eye and kind of the key reason why they want to separate the two primary dates was that February 15th primary would be just 2 days before the end of the 2028 legislative session. So if the primaries for the state elections were held at that same time, lawmakers during that legislative session would be kind of having to balance passing legislation versus also their re-election campaigns as well. So you can see another reason why they want to separate those two out.
Yeah, I mean, when I first saw that date and did the math, I think I had a mild heart attack myself as a reporter, imagining trying to cover the final 2 days of a legislative session plus a primary election. It would certainly be different. It would be very novel for New Mexico, but I don't think there's a lot of desire for legislators to move their own primary elections to February. Just the implications of that, and that would move up all the other timelines as far as filing for office, early voting, would be a very big change in New Mexico. So we'll see how this plays out. It looks like the Democratic leadership is pushing to keep those other races in, where they're currently at in June, but a lot can change between, now and next year's 60-day session.
So very interesting story here, Dan, is New Mexico on the cusp of putting themselves in that presidential primary spot that they've been looking for the past several years, but this is still pending final DNC approval, and obviously the state legislature having to put their stamp on this as well. And then you also add in the wild card of whoever wins the governor's race in November will also have a hand in this as well. So still some hurdles needed to be cleared before New Mexicans can put that February 15th, 2028 date on their calendars. Journal Capitol Bureau Chief Dan Boyd stopping by to share the latest with us. Thank you so much, Dan.
Hey, thanks. Appreciate it.
Former New Mexico House Majority Leader Cheryl Williams Stapleton's federal corruption trial is underway, with prosecutors and defense attorneys offering sharply different accounts of who was harmed. Prosecutors allege Stapleton and co-defendant Joseph Johnson conspired to divert more than $1.1 million from a company that received federal education funding through Albuquerque public schools, splitting the proceeds over several years. But Stapleton's attorney acknowledged she took money while arguing she stole from Johnson's company, not taxpayers, and that prosecutors cannot prove a conspiracy. Johnson's defense also claimed that he was a victim, saying Stapleton exploited his hands-off management of the company after the death of his son. Both defendants have pleaded not guilty to 37 federal charges, including conspiracy, bribery, mail fraud, and money laundering. A second former New Mexico Early Childhood Education and Care Department official has filed a whistleblower lawsuit alleging she was fired after exposing a $258 million budget shortfall tied in part to the state's universal child care program. Former Budget Director Kimberly Gonzalez claimed the department faces a funding gap that includes $155 million in expected trust fund revenue that was never transferred, $83 million needed to cover child care payments, and $20 million for other programs. Gonzalez said she warned agency leaders and the Department of Finance and Administration about the shortfall and recommended spending controls before she was placed on administrative leave and fired last month. Her lawsuit follows a similar complaint filed by the department's former chief financial officer. The Early Childhood Education and Care Department denies the allegations, calling the lawsuit unfounded, maintaining it does not retaliate against employees who raise concerns. An Albuquerque nonprofit is asking state regulators to require TXNM Energy to provide $240 million in customer rate credits following a controversial stock sale to Blackstone. Prosperity Works argues TXNM should have pursued a $350 million termination fee after the Public Regulation Commission ruled the company's $400 million stock transaction violated state law and ordered it unwound. The nonprofit claimed TXNM waived that claim to keep its proposed $11.5 billion merger with Blackstone alive, harming New Mexico ratepayers. TXNM disputes the allegation, saying it had no legal basis to collect the fee and plans to respond through the regulatory process. Despite the setback, the merger remains alive after both companies extended their agreement through May of 2027, with the Public Regulation Commission remaining the final major hurdle before the deal can move forward. And U.S. and Custom Border Protection has paused the installation of new groundwater wells tied to the border wall construction in Luna County and New Mexico's Boot Heel. The agency says it's developing a broader groundwater management strategy and will work with state officials and local landowners to minimize impacts on water sources. The move follows concerns from ranchers and state officials over wells drilled without New Mexico permits or hydrological studies, with pumps capable of drawing up to 300 gallons of water per minute. While local leaders call the pause a breakthrough, New Mexico's Office of the State Engineer says it's not enough. State officials are urging U.S. Customs and Border Protection to permanently plug the existing wells and obtain water through legal, permitted sources, warning the unauthorized drilling threatens water supplies relied on by ranchers, businesses, and communities across southern New Mexico. The leading news is powered by the journalism of the Albuquerque Journal. If you enjoy hearing all of the stories we share with you here daily, please consider becoming a digital subscriber to the Journal by utilizing the discount code in our show notes. Every subscription helps support local journalism and allows us to provide you with the news that matters to you. Now taking a look at Albuquerque's weather forecast. Today you can expect sunny and hot conditions with a high near 102, and as for this evening, mostly clear with a low around 70. To keep up with all the latest news from the Albuquerque Journal, you can visit our website at abqjournal.com. That's the leading news. I'm Gino Gutierrez. We'll be back tomorrow.